Our next core concept is configuration, and it's really important that we get this right. So if we take a look at our config directory, this is what ships with Laravel out of the box. And we've already briefly gone over this. And in general, you don't need to reach for any of these until you need to. So for example, maybe something related to mail. All right, well, for your mail driver, maybe you want to use a service like Mailgun or Mandrill. Well, at that point, you could reach for this. And I'll show you how to do that in the mail lesson. But you get the idea. Now, you'll see in most areas, the configuration file reaches for this helper function called env. This is reading from the PHP environment superglobal. So here's the way it works. When the framework loads up, it reads your .env file. Then, all of these keys are loaded up and stored within that superglobal. Now, your environment function simply provides a helper for reading that and providing a default on the condition that there isn't a corresponding key. So for example, in this case, we're saying, all right, well, tell me which driver you want. So we're going to look for an environment key called mail driver. But if you don't have one defined here, and let's see, if we scroll down, in this case, we do. But on the condition that we don't have one, let's fall back to SMTP. Now, in general, even though you can get away with this, I would always recommend for any environment key you reach for in your configuration, make sure it's referenced here. It's going to make things a lot easier in the future if you happen to migrate to a new server. So this means for any key, like let's say you're setting up SMTP for mail. Okay, you'd scroll down, you'd want to update the from address and from name. But again, rather than doing something like this, yeah, you could do that, but instead, reach for the environment file. So here, you would go to your .env file, see if it exists. It doesn't. So you could store it here. The from address will be jeffrey@laracasts.com. And you can do that here, and we'll do the mail from name as well. Next, if we keep scrolling down, here's the username and password for SMTP. Again, you're not going to provide a default there, because again, you don't want to store private keys and passwords and tokens within your version control. Instead, we're just going to read it from the environment superglobal. That means those private keys will instead be stored within your .env file, which is excluded from your Git version control, as you can see right here. So this means for every installation you have, you're going to have a separate environment file. So in this case, I have one for my development environment. And in these cases, you'll have things like this. You're going to turn debug mode to true rather than false. You're going to set the environment to local. You might set things like your queue driver or your session driver to either a log or a file-based approach, rather than something like Redis. But now again, once you push to production, well, production is going to have its own requirements. So on your production server, you would have another version of this file, where @debug would be set to false. You don't want to expose any private server data in the event of an error. You'd update your environment to production. I'll bring that back though. Next, things like your session driver, you might set that to Memcached or Redis. You would update your mail rather than maybe logging it to a storage file. Well, for production, you actually want to send the mail. So these values would be different. And once again, for anything else, like if you're using Pusher, that will assist with server-side to client communication, well, you'll have your development-specific keys and then your production-specific keys. And this is why you will have separate environment files for all of your environments, whether it's development, production, or even testing if you need it. Now, what about when I am in my project and I need to read a configuration value? For example, I noted a couple lessons ago, let's see if we still have it. Yeah, we have this little dummy Twitter class here that we're assuming needs an API key. Well, we did set up a provider for that, if you'll remember an episode ago. Remember, a provider is a class that bootstraps a particular feature or component with the Laravel framework. So here we can see, all right, well, whenever you request the Twitter class out of the container, we're just going to return, in this case, a singleton with the API key already populated. But you'll remember, I hard-coded the API key, and that goes against what I recommended in this episode. We don't want to store these API keys in version control. Instead, we read from a configuration file. So instead, I could use this config helper function. This is a function that allows us to read any of the keys and values stored here. And it follows a basic convention. You give the name of the file. So let's say we're looking in this services.php. This is often a good config file to add things like Mailgun or any third-party service that you use. Mailgun or Twitter or Postmark or Stripe, anything you want there. It can go here, or you can create a new file, and I'll show you how to do that in a minute. Anyways, you provide the name of the file. All right, in this case, it was called services.php. Next, you're going to use dot notation to find what you need. So let's say we want to look, we're going to have maybe a Twitter key here, and that will contain, I'm not sure what Twitter needs, but we're just going to assume it has a key for the public key they give you on the API version of their website. And then maybe there is a private or a secret key. Okay, and now in just a second, by the way, just if you're noticing it, we're going to move these private keys into the environment file where they belong, but one step at a time. Anyways, once we provide the name of the file, we're going to use dot notation to find the nested value we want. So in this case, if Twitter was equal to just a standard string, all right, I would say services.twitter. And that would open this file, and then the first key is called Twitter, so it will give me the value associated with that. But in our case, we actually want, maybe we'll say it's the secret key. All right, so we want services.twitter.secret. And there we go. Okay, so why don't we try this out? I'm going to go back to my standard route/web file, and let's resolve that Twitter class out of the container, and then die and dump it. Now, if we did everything correctly, we should have an instance of that Twitter class with a API or secret key equal to this. If I switch to the browser, sure enough, we get that. Okay, but now if I switch back, like I said, don't store these keys here because very likely for production, they're going to be different keys. So we want to make this as dynamic as possible. Instead, we're going to look for a Twitter key and then also a Twitter secret key. Okay, so let's go back to our environment file. And here is where I'm going to provide the development specific keys if they're different. So right here, we'll say Twitter key will be whatever it happens to be. And then the Twitter secret will be the other value. All right. Now we've removed those keys from version control, and instead we're just reading the superglobal to fetch what we need. So now if I come back and refresh, and I'm sorry, we changed it from private key to secret key, but same thing, it's still working. And this is the basic flow you're going to follow for all of your configuration needs. So let's say you're going to accept payments and you're going to use a service like Stripe. Okay, well, you could store a Stripe configuration key here, and they're going to have various tokens that you have to reference. Great. Now, anywhere in your project, if you need to read those tokens, all you have to do is reach for that helpful config function. So in this case, it would be services.stripe.token. Now though, this is useful. Oh, and by the way, it looks like there's already a Stripe example key that you can reach for here, since it's very common and popular in the Laravel world. But anyways, it might be possible that you don't want to store and jumble everything here. Instead, you want to create a new configuration file. No problem. You can see every single file here simply returns an array. So maybe what you decide to do is create a configuration file, maybe for your business. So in my case, I might have a Laracasts configuration file. And maybe this could have anything from administrator names and IDs. It could have full messages if we want to reach for that and make that dynamic. Anything we want can go here. Okay, so now if I wanted to store, something like that, or if we're going to put the Stripe information here, we can do that, no problem at all. You're still going to follow the exact same system. Anywhere in your project, you will read the configuration directory. The file name is called Laracasts, and in this case, the key would be Stripe and then private. And that would be fine as well. So you have a lot of flexibility here. I'll go ahead and delete that though. And that's basically all you need to know here. It's really not that complicated. Maybe just one final thing. Because all of your configuration is stored through various files, in production, it might be useful to merge all of that into a single file that Laravel can then load very, very quickly. Okay, take a look at this. If I run PHP Artisan, you'll see that there's a helper here under config. Config cache creates a cache file for faster configuration loading. So let's give that a shot. PHP Artisan config cache. Now, this can be a little confusing, and you wouldn't really want to reach for it in development. It's a production-specific optimization. What this is going to do is create a single configuration file that Laravel reads from, which means it's no longer loading and reading these, it's using that single cached and compiled file. So I'll show you. In our route/web file, where we die and dump Twitter, let's look at that one more time. I reload, and we get secret key, but let's change that. All right. Now Twitter's secret is secret key. Okay, but if I come back and give it a refresh, it's still going to be what we had before. So if you ever fall into this trap where you're changing values and it's just not being reflected, ask yourself, well, do I have a cached version of my configuration? And more often than not, that's going to be the case. So here's the rule. For development, there's no reason to do this. It is a performance optimization. We don't care about that for development. So I can say PHP artisan config clear. Now, if I come back and give it a refresh, it is reading from that file. However, for production, we do want to run that command, which means you need to set it up so that every time you deploy your project, you do run PHP artisan config cache. And if you ever make a change to your configuration, make sure that you call this command one more time so that we can reflect those changes. And again, this is the sort of thing that you will automate. It'll be part of your deploy script. You never even need to think about it. It's just a nice, quick win when you're in the production environment. All right, good job. We've now covered our third core concept.